Hello and welcome back to the Barrens. Today we are going to talk about the pestilence that completely tore Europe asunder. It was but a microscopic bacteria with painful and deadly consequences, and that is the Bubonic Plague. The Bubonic Plague, also known as the Black Plague or the Black Death, is an infection that killed between 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia in the 13 and 1400s. Its cause is the bacteria called Yersinia pestis, discovered by Alexander Yersin in the 19th century. It is spread through fleas on rodents and other animals. However, it's now speculated that humans were in fact the primary carrier of the fleas and lice that bore the bacterium. It could also be spread through droplets and infected blood. It's believed to have started in Asia over 2,000 years ago, though some research has shown that it could have even existed in Europe as early as 3000 BC. Symptoms include swollen lymph nodes, which can grow as large as chicken eggs, in the groin, armpit, and neck. There was also fever, chills, headache, fatigue, and muscle aches. It does still exist today, though it's very rare. There are only about 1,000 U.S. cases per year. But in the 1300s, a bacteria like this would completely annihilate its hosts. Blood and pus would ooze from the lumps on their bodies, and these lumps were extremely painful. Fever would rack their bodies, and they would be overcome with chills, diarrhea, and vomiting. It eventually spread to the blood or lungs, and before long it would end in death. It was a very painful way to go, as the blood would clot and organs would shut down. The three types of plagues are as follows. Bubonic. Now, this is the most common form. It's what causes the swollen lymph nodes and oozing buboes. It's usually spread through the bite of infected fleas. Then there was septicemic. This likely happens within a few days of exposure. The skin would turn black, mostly on the fingers, toes, and nose, hence the name Black Death. This is spread by infected flea bites and handling infected animals. And then there was pneumonic. As the plague advances, it becomes the most infectious form as it moves into the person's lungs. It's then able to pass from person to person by inhaling diseased air or touching bodily fluids. Infection would take 3 to 5 days before the person fell ill. Then it would take another 3 to 5 days before, in about 80% of cases, the patient would die. The average was about 23 days before the first person died from the introduction of the plague to a community. Through the 12th and 14th century, Mongols were dominating parts of Eurasia. The Kipchak Khanate, or Golden Horde, became part of the Western Mongol Empire. Janibeg and his army surrounded the Genoese trading port in Crimea in 1347. It is said that because so many of the men were dying from the plague, Janibeg began launching corpses into the town, and that he was aiming to infect the enemies with what was decimating his men. Trade was opened between Western Europe and China, a system known as the Silk Road. Everything from leather, spices, and stones were traded among these routes from 130 BC to 1453 AD, which contributed to the rapid spread of the pestilence. The Genoese ships carried this bacteria to Mediterranean ports, and it began to pick up traction. It hit Sicily in 1347, North Africa, Italy's mainland, Spain, and France in 1348, and then Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, Germany, and the Low Countries in 1349. So the plague was spread through trading ships, ravaging parts of the world. Unfortunately, it seemed to take Europe completely by storm, hitting their lands in October of 1347. And the cause? The Sicilian port of Messina docked 12 ships from the Black Sea. The people on board were either all dead or gravely ill. The authorities ordered the ships out of their port, but the order came far too late. The pestilence began to hit ports in Europe like wildfire and swept through towns, decimating all in its path. One of the most prominent causes that needs to be considered was the lack of hygiene present in medieval Europe. Germs were easily spread, and the fact that fleas and rats lived in every home and shop made it near inescapable. There was also the fact that when people began to flee from their homes, it usually just carried the disease along with them. In the 5 years following the pestilence's spread throughout Europe, about 45 to 50% of the population died. It had taken about 500 days for the pestilence to spread through the entire country. Landowners began to suffer because laborers were dying in mass. Land couldn't be cultivated and wages couldn't be met. Social structures broke down, and smaller areas were actually abandoned altogether. People at the time began to believe it was a punishment from God. There were processions, masses, fasting, prayer, and charms used during this time. Groups of people called the flagellants began to flog themselves in response, hoping to win God's forgiveness by punishing themselves for the sins of mankind. They would walk from town to town, continually whipping themselves and causing frenzy that led to murder and hysterics, until they were eventually banned by Pope Clement VI, who lived in Avignon, France at the time. There was also the idea that astrology had something to do with the plague. A concurrence of Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter were thought to heat up and corrupt the air of the earth. Now, physicians at the time, called plague doctors, were ill-equipped to handle something of this magnitude. The masks they wore, which were long-billed in the front like that of a bird, contained different herbs and oils, usually lavender and other flowers and oils, as an effort to purify the air before it passed through to their noses. These masks usually housed glass eye covers. They also fashioned an overcoat, gloves, boots, a wide-brimmed hat, and an outer garment. They treated every class of person hired by towns to try and cure the ill. Their practices were almost always ineffective, however. One of the practices included bloodletting through frogs or leeches. They would place them on the boils in hopes of letting out the bad blood. Patients were also encouraged to drink their own urine or take the medicine they crafted from eggshells, marigolds, and treacle. They were also washed with vinegar and rose water after being put to bed. They tried lancing the buboes as well, thinking that the disease would leave the body. They would then apply a mixture of tree resin, white lily roots, and dry human excrement. Of course, lancing the lumps would do little more than lead to septicemia and spread the disease even further. The food they were fed was mainly bread, fruit, and vegetables. Meats and cheeses were cut from their diet. There was also the witchcraft method, which involved placing a live chicken against the swollen bumps. As the chicken began to grow ill, it was thought that it was taking away the disease. The chicken would then be washed and then placed against the body's sores again. But it seemed that plague doctors were most known for keeping very detailed accounts of the sick in each town, along with the death tolls. For many, these doctors were a bad omen, and people would flee once they arrived in their town. Mountains of bodies began to pile up, and finding people to carry them out became difficult. It was often mountain men and women or those from the countryside that did the job, and they were paid more money to do so. The death rates climbed so quickly that the bodies began to just be dumped in large unmarked graves. People were layered on top of one another. Pope Clement VI even consecrated the entire Rhone River so corpses could just be thrown into it, as land was growing harder to find burial space. Public officials and churchmen tried to quarantine the sick by boarding up homes where the disease was present. Because fear ran rampant, while family and friends might have helped a sick loved one at first, people would soon turn to abandoning their homes and their sick to flee when the illness took more members. They would throw food and water beside them and then turn tail to make for safety. The smell of death permeated the very air, and people tried to mask it by use of fire and herbs. Now, a person worth noting is Guy de Shaliak. He was a French physician and surgeon who resided in Avignon during the plague. While other physicians fled, Shaliak stayed behind, documenting the pestilence and treating patients. He claimed that he also became infected but managed to survive. He was also able to class two types of the plague, bubonic and pneumonic. He advised Pope Clement VI to quarantine himself and to keep people out. Thus, the Pope followed his direction, sitting in a chair that had 4 large fires burning around him in order to burn any tainted air. He actually managed to survive the plague. Here is an account that Shaliak gave to the papal court. The great death toll began in our case in the month of January, 1348, and lasted for the space of 7 months. It was of 2 kinds. The first lasted 2 months, with continuous fever and spitting of blood, and death occurred within 3 days. The second lasted for the whole of the remainder of the time, also with continuous fever and with ulcers and boils in the extremities, principally under the armpits and in the groin, and death took place within 5 days. And it was of so great a contagion, especially when there was spitting of blood, that not only through living in the same house, but merely through looking, one person caught it from the other. Shaliak's methods typically included air purifying, vivisection or bleeding, and a healthy diet. So, what ended the Black Death? Well, it never really ended. It slowed, of course, but would reemerge again in London in 1665. What likely slowed this plague was quarantining, both from healthy and sick individuals. Eventually, as sanitation, hygiene, and medicine improved, so too did the outbreaks. But no one knows for sure how the plague really dissipated. But it was never quite as deadly as it was in the 14th century. So that's it for today's episode. This topic has always interested me, and I hope I was able to share something new with you. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks for joining me in the Barrens.